For nearly an hour, the little blind girl sat completely alone. Her white walking cane rested beside her chair as hundreds of guests filled the grand ballroom around her. Laughter echoed through the room. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. Important people moved from table to table hoping for a chance to meet the most powerful man in attendance. Yet somehow, in a room crowded with people, nobody seemed to notice the child sitting quietly by herself. Every few minutes, 10-year-old Emily Harper would lift her head whenever she heard footsteps coming her way. For a brief moment, hope would appear on her face. Then the footsteps would continue past her, and the hope would disappear just as quickly. She wasn't waiting for a friend. She wasn't waiting for a nanny. She was waiting for her father. And what made the situation even harder to understand was that her father was already in the room. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At the center of the ballroom stood Richard Harper, a billionaire businessman whose name carried influence across the country. Politicians wanted photographs with him. Reporters wanted interviews with him. Investors wanted meetings with him. Everywhere Richard went, people competed for his attention. Yet while strangers gathered around him, his own daughter sat alone only a short distance away. Most people at the event never noticed the contradiction. They saw the expensive suits, the flashing cameras, and the smiling faces. They saw success. They saw power. They saw a man admired by millions. What they didn't see was the little girl who had spent most of the evening listening for a voice that never came. Eventually, one person noticed her. His name was Michael Carter. Unlike the guests filling the ballroom, Michael wasn't there to network or celebrate. He was there to work. A single father doing everything he could to provide for his young son, Michael had learned to focus on his responsibilities and stay out of other people's business. But something about Emily kept pulling his attention away from the crowd. The longer he watched, the more one question bothered him. Why was a child sitting alone at one of the largest events in the city while everyone acted as though she wasn't there? And when Michael finally walked over to introduce himself, he had no idea that a simple conversation with a lonely little girl would expose a painful truth hidden behind one of America's most carefully protected public images. At first, Michael assumed there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Emily's father was busy greeting guests. Maybe he hadn't realized she was sitting alone, or maybe someone was supposed to be watching her. But as the minutes passed, those explanations became harder to believe because Richard Harper wasn't hidden away in some private meeting. He wasn't across town, and he wasn't even on another floor. He was standing less than 100 feet away, and somehow he still hadn't come over to speak to his daughter. "Do you come to these events often?" Michael asked. Emily nodded. "Sometimes." "Do you like them?" The little girl thought about it for a moment. "Not really." "Why not?" A small shrug. "They're usually the same." Michael smiled gently. "How so?" "People talk to Daddy," she said simply. The answer sounded innocent enough. Then she added something that immediately caught his attention. "Nobody really talks to me." The words hung in the air, not because they sounded dramatic, but because they sounded practiced, as though she had reached that conclusion a long time ago. Before Michael could respond, a voice echoed through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give another round of applause for Richard Harper." The room erupted. Applause thundered from every direction. Emily lowered her head, and Michael noticed it instantly. Most children would have been excited hearing their father's name announced, but Emily looked disappointed, and that was the moment Michael began paying closer attention. A few minutes later, enormous screens positioned around the ballroom flickered to life, and a promotional presentation began. Guests turned toward the screens as photographs from Richard Harper's career appeared one after another. Business awards, magazine covers, charity projects, meetings with presidents, governors, and celebrities. The audience applauded repeatedly. Michael glanced at the screen, then back at Emily. She sat quietly beside him, completely unaware of what was being shown. Of course she was. She couldn't see it. But Michael could, and something about the presentation immediately bothered him. The photographs kept changing, yet one thing never did. Richard Harper was in every image. Sometimes with executives, sometimes with politicians, sometimes with family members. Yet as Michael watched photograph after photograph appear, a strange realization began forming. Emily wasn't in any of them. At first, he assumed he had simply missed her, so he kept watching. 5 more photographs appeared, then 10, then 15. Still nothing. No Emily. No mention of Emily. No sign that she existed at all. Michael frowned. Maybe it was just coincidence. But before he could dismiss the thought, another detail caught his attention. The presentation shifted to a section titled The Harper Family. Several photographs filled the screen: Richard at holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, charity events with relatives, surrounded by smiling family members. Yet somehow, his blind daughter was absent from every single image. Michael looked down at Emily. She had no idea that hundreds of people were currently watching a presentation about the Harper family, and she wasn't part of it. A chill moved through him. Because coincidences happen once, maybe twice, but this felt different. This felt intentional. The presentation ended and applause filled the room again. Then a woman carrying event programs approached nearby tables. Michael accepted one absent-mindedly. As he flipped through the pages, his confusion deepened. There were sections about Richard's business achievements, sections about the charity foundation, sections about the Harper family's commitment to helping children, and even a full page dedicated to Richard's role as a father. Michael read it twice, then a third time. Not once was Emily mentioned. Not once. He turned another page, then another. Still nothing. The little girl sitting beside him seemed completely erased from the story the public had been given. And suddenly, Michael found himself asking a question he couldn't shake. Why? Why would a billionaire spend so much effort presenting himself as a devoted family man while leaving out his own daughter? The answer arrived sooner than he expected. A middle-aged woman wearing an event badge stopped beside their table. The moment she noticed Emily, her expression softened. "Hello, sweetheart." "Hi, Mrs. Jenkins," Emily replied. The woman smiled warmly, then noticed Michael sitting beside her. Relief flashed across her face. "It's nice to see someone keeping her company." Michael nodded politely. She seemed lonely. The woman opened her mouth as though she wanted to say something more. For a brief moment, Michael thought she might explain. Instead, she glanced across the ballroom toward Richard Harper. The smile disappeared, and when she spoke again, her voice was noticeably quieter. "Some things are better left alone." Michael blinked. "What do you mean?" The woman immediately looked uncomfortable. "I didn't say anything." Then she quickly walked away. Michael watched her disappear into the crowd. His confusion had just become something else: suspicion. Because people don't react that way when there's nothing to hide. And for the first time that evening, Michael stopped wondering whether Emily was being ignored. He started wondering if she had been hidden. Then Emily unknowingly said something that made his stomach drop. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you think Daddy knows I'm sitting here?" Michael stared at her. "What do you mean?" The little girl smiled sadly. "Sometimes people forget." A pause. Then she added quietly, "Daddy forgets more than most." And suddenly, the room felt very different, because Michael was no longer looking at a lonely child. He was looking at the first crack in a carefully constructed image that millions of people believed was real, while keeping the pacing, emotion, and suspense intact. For a long moment, Michael stood silently beside Emily's table as the sounds of the gala continued around them. Music floated through the ballroom. People laughed, and waiters carried silver trays from one end of the room to the other, yet suddenly none of it seemed important. All Michael could think about was the little girl sitting beside him. A girl who had spent her entire life surrounded by wealth, privilege, and opportunity, yet somehow felt completely invisible. He glanced once more toward the massive projection screen. Another photograph appeared: Richard Harper shaking hands with a senator, followed by applause. Then another: Richard standing beside a famous athlete. More applause. Then another: Richard with his two sons at a golf tournament. The crowd smiled warmly, but still no Emily. Not a single picture. Not one. Michael felt something twist in his stomach. This wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. Nobody forgot their daughter this many times, especially not while creating a presentation celebrating their family legacy. "Emily," Michael asked carefully, "has your dad always been like this?" The girl hesitated. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He used to carry me when I was little." Michael listened as she continued. "He would read stories to me." A small smile appeared. "For a while, everything was normal. Then the smile faded. But after I lost my sight," her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "Things changed." Michael's heart sank. "What happened?" Emily stared toward the sound of the orchestra. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just remember people always whispering around him. Doctors, reporters, Business partners. She paused. And then one day he stopped bringing me places. Michael felt a chill. Stopped bringing her places. Such a simple sentence, yet it carried years of pain. Did he tell you why? Emily shook her head. No, a tear slipped down her cheek. He just said some events weren't suitable for me. Michael looked around the room filled with people celebrating family, success, and image, and suddenly the pieces started fitting together. Richard Harper wasn't protecting Emily. He was protecting himself, his brand, his reputation, his perfect public image. The realization hit Michael like a punch. Before he could say anything else, a voice interrupted. Sir. Michael turned to see one of the senior event coordinators standing beside him. The woman looked nervous, very nervous. Mr. Carter, could I speak with you for a moment? Michael followed her a short distance away. The moment they were out of Emily's hearing range, the woman lowered her voice. You should stop asking questions. Michael frowned. Why? The woman glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. Because people who work here know not to. Michael stared. What does that mean? The coordinator hesitated, clearly debating whether to continue, then sighed. Emily isn't supposed to be part of the public story. Michael's jaw tightened. The public story? The woman nodded. The company spends millions every year building Richard Harper's image. They don't want anything that could make investors question strength or stability. Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. She's his daughter. I know. The woman said quietly, looking ashamed. But that's the explanation everyone gets. For several seconds, Michael couldn't speak. He looked across the ballroom, across the smiling faces, the expensive suits, and the giant screen displaying Richard Harper's carefully crafted life, and suddenly all of it felt hollow. Because hidden behind every photo was a child who had been erased. An hour later, the ballroom lights dimmed as the evening's main presentation began. Guests returned to their seats, conversations faded, and excitement spread through the room. At the center stage, a spotlight appeared, then Richard Harper walked onto the platform. The applause was immediate, thunderous. Hundreds of people rose to their feet, some even cheering. Richard smiled confidently, the image of success, power, and perfection. Michael looked toward Emily. She remained seated, alone, listening, waiting, perhaps hoping that this time her father would acknowledge her. Richard began speaking. He thanked investors, executives, partners, friends, and even his sons. The crowd applauded again. Michael glanced at Emily, whose expression slowly fell as she realized something. Richard had thanked nearly everyone in his life except her. Then came the final blow. A massive montage appeared on the screen. Family photos, childhood memories, vacations, birthdays, graduations, hundreds of images. And not one included Emily. Not one. The ballroom erupted into applause as the presentation ended, but Michael couldn't clap. Because he saw what nobody else noticed, a single tear rolling down Emily's face. That was the moment he made his decision. Someone needed to say something, and apparently nobody else would. As guests gathered around Richard after the presentation, Michael walked directly toward him. Every step felt heavier than the last as security, executives, and investors watched him approach. Finally, he stood face to face with one of the most powerful men in the country. Richard looked mildly annoyed. Can I help you? Michael took a breath and asked a question that instantly changed everything. Why are you ashamed of your daughter? Silence. The words landed like a bomb. Nearby conversations stopped. Heads turned. Richard's smile vanished. What did you say? Michael didn't back down. I asked why you're ashamed of your daughter. The crowd grew quiet. Richard's face darkened. That's an outrageous accusation. Is it? Michael pointed toward the stage. You showed hundreds of photos tonight. You thanked dozens of people. But somehow your daughter wasn't in any of them. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard tried to maintain control. This isn't the time or place. Michael nodded. No. The right time would have been years ago. Now the entire room was watching. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard looked furious. But for the first time, something else appeared in his eyes. Fear. Because deep down, he knew Michael was right. Then something unexpected happened. A voice spoke from the crowd. Soft. Fragile. Dad. Everyone turned. Emily had stood up, her white cane in one hand, her face trembling. The ballroom became completely silent. Richard stared at her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Emily asked the question that broke every heart in the room. Did I do something wrong? The room froze. Her voice shook. Because I've spent years trying to figure it out. If I did something wrong, I wish you'd tell me. Tears filled her eyes. I know I can't see, but I still love you. The silence that followed felt endless. And in that silence, every excuse Richard had ever built began collapsing. Because suddenly this wasn't about investors, or public image, or business. It was about a little girl asking her father why she wasn't enough. Richard stood motionless. Then, for the first time all evening, his confident mask disappeared. Years of guilt, shame, cowardice, and regret surfaced at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. No, Emily. Tears appeared in his eyes. You never did anything wrong. The room remained silent as Richard slowly stepped off the stage and walked toward his daughter. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally reached her, he dropped to one knee. The billionaire no longer looked powerful. He looked like a father who had failed. I was wrong, his voice cracked. So terribly wrong. Emily stood frozen as he reached for her hand. I convinced myself I was protecting the company, he said, shaking his head. But really, I was protecting myself. Tears streamed down his face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Many guests were crying openly now. Then something beautiful happened. Emily wrapped her arms around him. And for the first time in years, Richard hugged her back, right there in front of everyone. Exactly where she should have been all along. Months later, Richard Harper held another company event, but this time it was different. The first photograph guests saw was not of business or awards, but of Richard and Emily together, smiling, proud, and unapologetic. And when Richard took the stage, the first person he introduced was his daughter. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but nobody smiled more than Michael Carter, the single father who had simply noticed a lonely girl in a crowded room. Because sometimes changing a life doesn't require power, money, or influence. Sometimes it only requires the courage to see someone everyone else has ignored. And sometimes the most important person in a room isn't the billionaire on the stage. It's the child sitting quietly in the corner, hoping someone remembers they matter. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what truly matters in life.